Picture this. It's your weekly D&D game. Your party has been exploring an underground dungeon for weeks now, fighting your way through chamber after chamber, hardly a break in sight, and finally, you come across a room that, upon first inspection, appears to be clear. Thinking that there's nothing in here, you move to the middle of the room and begin picking the perfect spot to set up your camp, when suddenly you hear an odd sloshing sound behind you. And as you turn around, you look just in time to see as a translucent creature begins darting toward your party, and oddly enough, it's in the shape of a dragon's head. Hello! This is a new series I'm starting called Monster Mashup Mondays, where I take two D&D monsters, slap those babies together, and see what I can come up with. If you're interested in seeing more content like this, I highly recommend you subscribe, because I'm planning on making this a weekly series here on my channel. For this first monster, my head immediately went to the Gelatinous Cube. The Gelatinous Cube is a transparent cube of goo that just sits in dungeons motionless, waiting for parties to stumble upon it. When the cube isn't moving, it's virtually invisible, making it a perfect ambush predator in these dungeons, and its only goal is to engulf. When the Gelatinous Cube engulfs a creature, it gets stuck inside of its jello-y body and begins to be dissolved by the acid within. The Gelatinous Cube is a very fun monster for low-level parties to take on, as the battle consists mostly of trying to yank your allies out of the cube, or if you happen to be the engulfed ally, getting yourself out of that cube. When trying to come up with a monster to pair with the Gelatinous Cube, I decided I wanted to stay on theme with acid damage. Naturally, my mind went to the ancient black dragon. Now, as somebody who loves dragons, it hurts me to admit that dragons in D&D are pretty boring. They mostly fight the same, regardless of what kind of dragon it is. They'll have a claw, a bite, a tail attack, a wing attack, and then they'll have some breath weapons. If they're a chromatic dragon, it'll just be an elemental damage-based breath weapon. Whereas if they're a metallic dragon, they'll have two breath weapons, an elemental one and then a condition-inflicting one. Something that may, say, stun creatures who fail saving throws. Because the D&D dragons can be pretty boring like this, though, I ultimately decided I wanted to lean more on the Gelatinous Cube side of things rather than the dragon side of things. And so, with these two creatures in mind, I present to you my creation, the Draconic Goo. Beginning with the lore of this creature, when an ancient black dragon dies, the acid stored within its body begins to corrode its own corpse. Depending on the power of the dragon in question, sometimes that acid can begin to take on a life of its own. You see, as the acid begins to dissolve the body and dissolve the very magical essence of the dragon, it can begin to coalesce and form a transparent, gooey version of the dragon head that once lived. This gooey dragon head is the Draconic Goo. The Draconic Goo, much like the Gelatinous Cube, is first and foremost concerned with eating. But like the ancient black dragon, it does this by moving quickly and spewing acid over its targets, making it easier for it to engulf. Once the Draconic Goo has engulfed the maximum number of creatures within its body, it will immediately flee any remaining enemies, hoping to find a quiet little corner in the dungeon all to itself, where it can peacefully digest its recently captured prey. But how exactly does it do this? Well, let's take a look at the stat block. Let's get some of the boring stuff out of the way first. CR, size, ability scores, things like that. I wanted this to be a high challenge rating creature, much like the ancient black dragon is. And so I decided to give this thing a challenge rating of 22, slightly higher than the ancient black dragon's challenge rating of 21. Since the Gelatinous Cube's highest stat is con, I decided to preserve that, giving it a con of 28. But on the flip side, since the Gelatinous Cube has low intelligence and charisma, I decided to give it also low intelligence and charisma, giving it only an 8 in both scores, which gives players a weakness they can exploit. I made strength its second highest stat, since ancient black dragons are very strong, and I decided to leave dex and wisdom middle tier for this challenge rating. As for saving throw proficiencies, strength and con made the most sense to me. I couldn't really justify giving it proficiency in any of the mental stats in particular, considering that this thing doesn't really have a lot going on upstairs. I decided though to keep the same skill proficiencies that an ancient black dragon would have, meaning it's proficient in both perception and stealth. Much like the Gelatinous Cube, I wanted this to be a creature that relied entirely on blind sight, simply sensing the presence of creatures nearby. And so for the radius of that blind sight, I decided to go with 120 feet, which is the same radius as an ancient black dragon's dark vision, so it felt kind of comparable to the original creature. And most importantly from this section, I wanted this thing to be fast. Imagine all the trouble of a Gelatinous Cube, but also it's fast enough that you can't catch the thing. That feels like a very fun and engaging fight to me that could lead to potential chase sequences. And so I ultimately decided to give it a speed of 60 feet per round, which is a little bit lower than the ancient black dragon's fly speed of 80 feet per round, but still much faster than the original Gelatinous Cube. As for the creature's abilities, naturally at this challenge rating, it's going to have legendary resistances. And since it is inspired by the Gelatinous Cube, I decided to preserve its transparent and ooze abilities. The transparent ability is what dictates that the Gelatinous Cube, and thus the Draconic Goo, is hard to see when it is not moving, and it's what sets the DC for perceiving that creature. For the Draconic Goo, I decided that DC should be 19, making it much harder to see than the original Gelatinous Cube, but not so hard that a high-level party has no chance of finding it at all. As for the ooze ability, this is really what defines a lot of the functionality and physics of how a Gelatinous Cube works, and thus how the Draconic Goo works. The ooze ability is what tells you that other creatures are able to enter the space of the Draconic Goo on their turn, if they so choose, but they will be subject to the Draconic Goo's engulf ability and will have disadvantage on the saving throw when they do so. This ability is also what dictates how many creatures the Gelatinous Cube, and thus the Draconic Goo, can engulf. For the Gelatinous Cube, the number of creatures it can engulf is really determined by its size. I considered implementing that as well for the Draconic Goo, but being that I decided this should be a size huge creature, given that a dragon head would in fact be huge, I ultimately decided just to leave it as the same number of creatures a Gelatinous Cube could engulf. As for the Draconic Goo's actions in combat, I gave it 3 choices. First, it can use a multi-attack. Much like the ancient black dragon had a multi-attack in which it can bite and claw, I decided that this should also have a multi-attack. But being that this is a goopy goo creature, that multi-attack is exclusively pseudopod attacks. These attacks can be really fun from a flavor perspective. Maybe the pseudopod that hits first is a literal tooth that grows out and just slaps somebody, or maybe it's the horn of the dragon wrapping around somebody. You can get really fun and flavorful because it's a pseudopod and have it come from anywhere on this goopy head. The second action I gave this creature is the classic engulf ability from a Gelatinous Cube. I basically took this verbatim, as it is the defining feature of a Gelatinous Cube and the defining feature of also the Draconic Goo. The way this ability works is that the Draconic Goo is able to move up to its speed. While doing so, it passes through the space of as many creatures as it possibly can. Every creature whose space it passes through is at risk for being engulfed. To avoid being engulfed, a creature needs to make a dexterity saving throw. Given the challenge rating of the creature, I decided a DC of 19 was most appropriate. If a creature succeeds on this dexterity saving throw, it's pushed 5 feet out of the way of the Draconic Goo. But if it fails the saving throw, it is sucked into the Draconic Goo and starts being digested by the acid within. When it's first engulfed, it only takes 3d8 acid damage, which isn't too punishing, especially at this challenge rating. But so long as it remains engulfed, at the start of each of the Draconic Goo's turns, the creature will take acid damage once again, but this repetitive acid damage is 68 instead. Also, while engulfed in this way, the creature is considered to be restrained. For reference, a restrained creature has a speed of 0 and cannot benefit from any bonuses to speed. Also, attacks against the creature have advantage, while the creature's own attacks will have disadvantage. Lastly, a restrained creature also has disadvantage on dexterity saving throws. While this disadvantage on dexterity saving throws might not seem like a big deal since you already have been engulfed, it really can be punishing depending on what your party members do. Let's say your wizard targets the goo with a fireball. Well, every creature that is engulfed is also going to have to make that dexterity saving throw, and they're going to be doing it with disadvantage. So you could accidentally harm your own party members and maybe speed up or directly cause their death. Its last ability is the one I am most proud of. You see, I wanted this ability to be a spin on a dragon's breath weapon, but I didn't want it to be just, oh, you take a bunch of acid damage, or, oh, you are inflicted with a condition. No. I wanted this breath weapon to make it easier for the Draconic Goo to engulf. After all, the Goo's entire goal is to engulf and eat as many creatures as it can, so naturally, it would have abilities that lend itself to doing so. I've decided to call this breath weapon Gelatinous Spew. It sounds absolutely disgusting, because it is. When the Draconic Goo uses its Gelatinous Spew ability, it spews something called gelatinous acid in a 90-foot long, 10-foot wide line directly in front of its face. Every creature in that line must succeed on a DC 19 dexterity saving throw, keeping it on par with the DCs for the rest of this thing's abilities. If a creature fails its saving throw, 2 things happen to it. First, it takes acid damage, 10d8 acid damage specifically. Second, it is now covered covered in the gelatinous acid that's spewed forth from this creature. If you succeed on the saving throw, you'll only take half damage and you aren't covered in the acid. The gelatinous acid portion of this ability is where it really shines. Being covered in gelatinous acid causes 3 things to happen. First, a creature covered in gelatinous acid will take 2d8 acid damage at the start of each of its turns. Second, a creature covered in gelatinous acid will also have disadvantage on dexterity saving throws. And that's because of the nature of the draconic goo. This thing is fast moving, meaning the acid it's spewing forth is going to be incredibly slippery, making it difficult to make the fast and precise movements required of dexterity saving throws. This is very beneficial for the draconic goo because its engulf ability requires the creatures in question to succeed on a dexterity saving throw. So if you are covered in acid, it is going to be harder for you to resist engulfing. But the third effect of the gelatinous acid is actually a beneficial one to the player. Because when you're covered in gelatinous acid, things are so slippery and lubed up, creatures that are covered in gelatinous acid can actually move at twice their normal speed. Given that the draconic goo itself is a very fast moving creature, this could be very beneficial to players, giving them an opportunity to actually get out of its range. Or if the draconic goo tries to run away, any creature covered in gelatinous acid is going to have an easier time chasing it down. The gelatinous acid can be scraped off of a player if they choose to use their action, or an ally can try to scrape it off for you. Regardless of who tries to scrape it off, you will be taking some acid damage as you come into contact with the gelatinous acid, specifically 3d8 acid damage. But no matter what your players decide to do with the gelatinous acid, the draconic goo's goal is the same: engulf and flee, which brings me to its bonus action. I gave the draconic goo one bonus action that really can throw a wrench in some of your players' plans. It's a bonus action dash. Being that the draconic goo has a movement speed of 60 feet, were it to use its movement speed, its bonus action dash, and the action dash that all creatures have access to, that means it can move up to 180 feet in a single round, making it incredibly hard and for some parties, downright impossible to catch up with. Lastly, there are the draconic goo's legendary actions. I only gave it 2 to keep things simple. The first legendary action is your basic attack one. In this case, that means using its pseudopod. It costs 1 legendary action, and it can use its pseudopod to attack 1 creature within range. Its other legendary action is called Slime Trails. This utilizes 2 of its 3 legendary actions, so it's higher cost than just attacking and can only be done once per round. But what Slime Trails does is it enables the draconic goo to move up to its speed around the chamber it's in. In doing so, it leaves behind trails of slime on all of the squares it's touched. Those trails of slime will go away after a minute, or if you expose them to water. These slime trails count as difficult terrain, and any time a creature enters a slime trail for the first time on a turn, it needs to make a dexterity saving throw. Again, DC 19. If they succeed, nothing happens. But if they fail, they'll slip and fall prone. Now, the prone condition isn't all that punishing, especially not in a fight like this. While a character is prone, 3 things happen. First, they'll have disadvantage on attacks. Second, if a creature is within 5 feet of them, that creature will have advantage to attack them. And third, if a creature is more than 5 feet away from them, the creature will have disadvantage to attack them. This is actually a common misconception around the prone condition. A lot of people word it as, oh, melee attacks have advantage, but range attacks have disadvantage. But really, it's within 5 feet and not within 5 feet. Meaning, let's say you're making a melee attack with a glaive, a reach weapon. If you're 10 feet away, that's still disadvantage. Or let's say this creature tries to attack you with its pseudopod. That pseudopod has a 10-foot reach. If that creature's 10 feet away, doesn't matter if it's a melee attack, it's still disadvantage. Furthermore, if a creature is within 5 feet of you and they try to make a ranged attack with something like a longbow or a crossbow, they technically have advantage on that attack, negating the disadvantage that is normally imposed by being within 5 feet of an enemy creature when making a ranged attack. But back to the draconic goo slime trails. The purpose of the slime trail ability isn't to somehow make it easier to engulf or to deal damage, but rather battlefield control. The draconic goo has a vested interest in keeping these creatures nearby until it can engulf them. And so maybe it spreads its slime trails in front of the doorways, or maybe it surrounds the party in a circle of slime, things that can make it harder for them to flee, without being overly punishing on the players, as there are many ways to get around things like difficult terrain and prone. Now, with this big stat block in mind, and with the narrative description I gave you in mind, the only question that remains is, how the hell do you actually play this thing in combat? Now, when I come up with strategies for monsters, my goal isn't just to maximize damage or kill any player I can. Instead, my goal is to create a fight that is challenging while still being winnable, and encourages player creativity and strategy. With that goal in mind, let's talk strategy. The Draconic Goo is likely going to start combat in a chamber unmoving, giving it an opportunity to surprise players. Regardless of whether or not it gets a surprise round in combat, it's going to prioritize its actions as follows. First priority, Gelatinous Spew. That way, it'll be easier for it to execute its second priority, Engulfing. However, it'll never use its Gelatinous Spew ability on back-to-back turns, even if it does recharge. Otherwise, it doesn't get to engulf as much. And then lastly, I would put the Pseudopod multi-attack. As a DM, the Pseudopod multi-attack is really there for you to have an opportunity to kind of pull back and balance the encounter while it's happening to give your players a better chance of succeeding and having a fun, engaging fight. What if the first time the Draconic Goo used its engulf ability, it manages to engulf 3 of your 4 party members? You probably don't want to engulf the next turn. Give the players a moment to break free or strategize or do some damage before just getting everybody into that queue. Or let's say you have half the party engulfed, but everybody's at really low health. Maybe you want to give them a round of pseudopods, see if they heal, drag combat out a little bit more, make things a little bit more exciting and engaging beyond just beating the shit out of your players. As for its bonus action dash, sprinkle this into the combat whenever necessary to traverse large distances. Let's say that you happen to have this fight in a chamber that is 150 feet wide. The Draconic Goo might need to bonus action dash a lot more than a Draconic Goo that is fighting in a 60-foot wide room. It really depends on the terrain you're dealing with. Other than that, it would only really be using this bonus action dash ability when it's trying to run away. There are 2 situations where this thing would run away. The first situation, it has engulfed as many creatures as it possibly can, at which point it wants to go and digest in peace. The second situation, this thing is on death's door. This thing wants to eat and survive above all else. It doesn't have ulterior motives or other goals. If it starts getting low health, it's booking it. And lastly, legendary actions. I would highly recommend that you have some strategically placed slime trails in the room at any point in time during the encounter. Meaning first round of combat, this thing is going to burn 2 legendary actions in order to use its slime trail ability. You're going to want to use your judgment as to how many slime trails you really want to have at any given point in time, just based on the size of the room you created and how your party seems to be handling them. And then you can just use the pseudopod legendary actions at any point in time when you feel that there are enough slime trails in the room. But all that being said, there are a lot of different ways you could choose to play the Draconic Goo. The choice is ultimately yours and really depends on the party you're designing this encounter for. And so that's it. I've gone ahead and posted a copy of the stat block at the links down below. If there are any monsters you would love to see in a future Monster Mashup Monday, leave it in the comments down below. Ooh, and if you're artistically inclined, I would love to see your renditions of a Draconic Goo. I have 0 drawing skills, so that is impossible for me to accomplish. But I'm sure someone out there seeing this is actually good at art and could do that. And so I would love to see it. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to see more of these, go ahead and subscribe. I'm planning on posting these once a week, every single Monday, and hopefully I will see you next time. Bye-bye.